This article here is about the boycott, diplomatic boycott by some nations and how China is responding. I noticed one thing about China, like the spokespeople, compare that to like people in the White House, that lady in the White House, when she speaks to reporters. Look at her style, right? Compared to the Chinese style, they tend to get angry and shouting. It's like they seem to believe that if you shout and if you get angry, that people will get scared and just go away, and they will accept what you're saying. But that's not the way. That's not the way it works at all. They get angry. Yeah. They get very angry. So a Chinese government spokesperson said the U.S. committed evil crimes against Native Americans in a bid to counter reports of genocide. This is how the Chinese are, It's like, well, what about this? What about that? They also mention about, well, what about all these things, how you treat African Americans and so forth. So it's like, okay, we talking about the U.S. is accusing them of genocide, sterilizing a woman, the Uyghur woman, I think it's Xinjiang. And it's like, well, what about how you treat black people in America? What about this? What about this? What about George Floyd? It's like they don't deal with what they're accused of. They're going back in history. So they're going back to a time when the U.S., in the early days of the U.S., when people came here from Europe, forming a nation. And that's the way, unfortunately, that's the way the world was back then, Yeah. Everybody, all the European powers, the French were here too. The French. And then they had the Louisiana Purchase under Napoleon Bonaparte when he sold that set of land because he needed money to fight his wars in Europe. Otherwise, if Napoleon didn't need that money, all that area like Louisiana, all the way up to the Dakota, that would have been French. So my point is, all the powers, all the major powers in Europe were doing that. The French, the British, of course, the Spanish, then you had the Belgians and so forth. They all had colonies. They all went all over the world. The Portuguese, same thing. So he's picking on the U.S. That a Chinese person railed against the U.S. diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics. The U.S. had announced a boycott in response to Beijing's ongoing genocide of the Uyghur minority. Zhao Lijian fired back by accusing the U.S. of committing evil crimes against Native Americans. So we talking about we going back in the 17th and 18th century. We talking about. This is how far back China is going. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian lashed out at the U.S. on Tuesday for its diplomatic boycott of the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. You see, and saying that allegation of genocide which China faces over its treatment of the Uyghur minority fits the U.S. better than anyone else for its treatment of Native Americans. Yeah. The U.S. has been fabricating the biggest lie of the century about so-called genocide in Xinjiang, but it has long been debunked by facts. Well, first of all, China doesn't let anybody in independently. China is a very arrogant country. They don't let anybody in, to show. to say, well, okay, let's bring in people that are neutral to see what's going on. They're not going to do that. They just said, take our word for it. The accusation is that they're sterilizing Uyghur women. And I've seen people on TV, families who say they can't get in touch with their families in China. You know? I mean, that's not right. So this is like during the time of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, when the Germans were transferring German citizens that were Jews, you know, to like Poland, death camps in Auschwitz, and the world did nothing. So, you know, we live in, you know, it's like 70, 80 years later, what are we supposed to do? Just sit back and let another genocide happen? Just because China is arrogant and saying, well, you know, the U.S. is fabricating. No, it's not just the U.S., come on. Australia too, Canada too, Great Britain too, all these countries. So it's not just the U.S. It just happens that the U.S. is the most powerful, and they decide, well, China decides they're going to pick at the U.S. He said the diplomatic boycott, which the White House announced on Monday, citing ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity by Beijing, is based on ideological biases as well as lies and rumors. Well, you know the way you could solve that problem? By opening up and let people go in, independent of the United Nations, go in there and see what's going on in those camps. Because you can't tell me you have all these people that are Muslims in a camp, sitting there behind, you know, doing work and so forth. These people really want to be there? Come on. Or they want to be free. And they have no choice because China is a totalitarian state. That's what it really amounts to. Zhao denounced the U.S. for committing evil crimes against Native Americans and said that the boycott gravely violates the well, you know, if we start talking about crime, we could talk about Belgium and the Congo, French shooting black people, you know, in West Africa with machine guns or cannons or what have you, and so forth. So we can go on and on if you want to go back in time. Even China. I mean, remember China talks about the Century of Humiliation, how they were treated by the European power, like the British, the French, even the Japanese. The Japanese was in Manchuria, and that wasn't even ancient time when the Japanese were in Manchuria, in eastern China. So we could go back to those times. And then the Opium Wars also, when European powers forced opium in China. So there's a lot to talk about. But those were those days, how things used to be. You see? Because back in those days, you didn't have the kind of international understanding. It was like might makes right, you know? And it was like every major power was out for itself. The French tried to doing the British tried to doing and stuff for here in America. Louis the 16th ended up being beheaded by a guillotine, right? Because he was competing with the British in America, and he was helping the American colonialists by putting money in here, you see, to wage war against the British. Why? Because he was competing, the French were competing against the British. And that's how it was. Not because he liked these people. Yeah. So that's how it was. And the British too. The British too were helping, from what I understand, the Haitians in Haiti, who overthrew, who declared a free state from France. So the British were helping, They all were trying to do each other in, because the whole aim was that, if you come out on top, you're going to be like the wealthiest and the most powerful nation. And that's how it was. So Australia, the UK, and Canada have since joined the US in the boycott, which will still allow the athletes to compete while their diplomatic representatives stay home. Other Chinese diplomats have ridiculed the U.S. boycott and saying President Joe Biden was flattering himself to assume U.S. officials had been invited. That's kind of funny, So they're saying, well, we didn't invite you anyway. So who are you to say that you're not coming? You never had an invitation. But at the same time, they're saying, well, you know what? The fact that you're not coming, you're going to pay. It reminds me of the story of the fox trying to get the grapes. And he jumps up and he couldn't get it. And when he couldn't get it, he said, well, these grapes must be sour. That's why I can't reach them. So this is what this really amounts to. Sour grapes. Yeah. So Zhang Hiqing said, the U.S. politicians, and look at this, they're using Twitter, by the way, and Twitter, from what I understand, I don't think you can use it unless maybe using a VPN, but private network. In China, I don't think you can use Twitter in China. Are the U.S. politicians worried about not inviting the Beijing Winter Olympics? Thus, they're flattering themselves by announcing a diplomatic boycott to it. The Chinese are saying, we never invited you anyway. So who are you to say you're not coming? You never had a ticket. You never had an invitation. Of course, that's all silly. Zhao has consistently decried frequent reports that China has been detaining hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and people from other Muslim minority in Xinjiang, breaking up families and attempting to erase their cultures and religious loyalty. Many Uyghurs have been forced to work in labor camps picking cotton. On Wednesday, Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act with a vote of 428 to 1, imposing economic sanctions on China for all goods produced by forced labor. So what it is China, because China has become arrogant, and I'll tell you something, if you go back to like before 1980, China was a very poor country. They didn't have much, and they could barely feed their people, the population in China. And then they created, I think under Deng Xiaoping, something like that. Deng Xiaoping. They created that economic zone in southern China that Western countries could come in. And that's what happened. So when I was growing up, when I was a teenager here, growing up, we had lots of jobs like in the factory. So if you're a person who dropped out of school, you could easily get a job. You could go to a factory and you could still make some decent money, And that's how it is. I mean, Brooklyn, for example, is called the industry city because we had lots of factories. Even where I live here, they used to be like clothing. You walk by and you see the machines, and you see the spinning, and you see the threads and so forth, making clothes and so forth. Yeah, we had a lot of that stuff. And most of that stuff been transferred to like Asia, China and South Asia, places like Bangladesh, I think Sri Lanka, all these places like that. They have our jobs now, see? So, and it was all greed. Wall Street wanted to make a lot of money. They figure, we're going to transfer jobs to these countries. We don't have to worry about OSHA because, here we had the Triangle factory fire going back in the early 1900s. when a lot of women died due to a fire, the place was padlocked. And then, so in the time being, you have like OSHA that was created in I believe it was the 70s. So once you send your work out overseas, you don't have to worry about all these regulations under the U.S., whether somebody locks. And you see that happen, I think it's in Bangladesh, where there were fires. Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, where there were fires that killed people and, so forth. So for these greedy business people in the United States, well, that's not our problem, If they lock their factories, they lock the door, they notify this and so forth. So because we send all these jobs to China, China got a lot of money, and China was able to get rich in no time. Look how fast China went from being a poor country to a very well-to-do country with a lot of military might. And that has to do with greed, Western greed, you see. They wanted to make so much money on Wall Street. They wanted their investors to benefit. So greed is what helped China become the powerhouse that it is today. Because if Western countries didn't invest in China, send in all these jobs, factory jobs, they make the iPhone in China, they make just about everything in China. Now, if China didn't have all those jobs, China would never be as powerful as it is today. And also, they would never be as arrogant as they are today. And all they would be talking about is the Century of Humiliation, which is very common in their discussion. Century of Humiliation, as to how they were treated by Western powers.